Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Creating and Delivering Highly Engaging Learning in a Hybrid Work Environment. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst at Brandon Hall Group, and Ryan Morris, Litmos Mentor at SAP Litmos. Ryan joined SAP Litmos in November 2018 after moving to Birmingham, Alabama. He began his career in account management, but later realized his enthusiasm for customer onboarding and training. Ryan delights in helping people creatively solve their training dilemmas using the best LMS out there. I would like to extend a thank you to SAP Litmos for sponsoring today's webinar. SAP Litmos develops e-learning solutions for top-performing companies. An established leader in the market since 2007, SAP Litmos offers the world's easiest to use LMS, SAP Litmos Training, and a comprehensive course library, SAP Litmos Training content. Thousands of companies trust the solutions to centralize and deliver transformative training to employees, customers, and partners. The solutions are used by more than 24 million people in 150 countries across 35 languages. Find more information at www.litmos.com. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that we have several certification programs currently open for enrollment, including our Certified Learning Strategist program. Visit certification.brandonhall.com for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research. If you see any surveys on our schedule that you would like to participate in, it's always greatly appreciated. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. You can also visit our main website, brandonhall.com, and click on Open Surveys for the latest list. And last but certainly not least, we ask that you join in on the discussion with our presenters today. Please write in your questions and comments using your control panel. Ryan and Dave will be keeping an eye on anything coming through throughout the presentation and answer what they can in real time. Anything that we don't get to during the presentation will be answered during Q&A. And without any further delay, I'm turning things over to Dave so we can get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa, and welcome everybody. And appreciate you joining Ryan and I today as we talk through some of the challenges and hopefully strategies to move forward as we look at learning in a hybrid work environment and what that means for different organizations. And of course, as Melissa mentioned, we definitely want you to ask questions throughout. We want this to be as open as a dialogue as possible in this format, so please feel free to do that. But to get started, I just want to sort of walk through some of the research that we've seen here at Brandon Hall Group around what's going on as organizations from an L&D perspective react to their current work environment that they face. And as we all know, the pandemic definitely created a huge shift in how and where people work. And then over the last 2 to 3 years, things have definitely continued to change and evolve as we move forward away from that environment. So to sort of kick us off and get a sense of what's going on, I'd like to understand what's going on in your organization. So we've got a poll question up. Hopefully you're able to respond to this poll question. And we just want to know what is the environment like at your organization currently? Is everybody completely 100% on site? Maybe you're mostly on site, but you still have some folks that are remote. Could be evenly split. And of course, you could actually still be mostly remote with only some on site. And we do also know of some organizations that are still completely all remote. And, obviously there were some organizations that were completely remote prior to the pandemic. So that didn't change much for them. But just want to get a sense of what's going on with the folks on the line so we know what the dynamic is for what we're dealing with here. So I'll give a few more seconds for people to participate in the poll. We just want to make sure we get a good representation. Elizabeth does mention that her organization is about half and half. So we'd like to see that. And, Ryan, you can come say hi because I think you're trying to have it both ways. I think you're working remotely, yet you're making it appear as though you're in an office.
Well, I felt so bad because we were doing we're doing a hybrid work environment webinar, and I'm very much not hybrid. at all right now. We're still fully remote. So I wanted to give us a little flavor of an office while we were here. And, I think that the word hybrid takes on so many different meanings depending on who you ask, and depending what makes the most sense for your organization. So hopefully today what we're able to talk about are things that you can use for best practices and delivering training in a way that makes sense for your organization.
Yeah. And so interestingly enough, I expected sort of a bell curve in responses where that evenly split was probably going to be the largest group. It's actually the largest group is mostly remote still, with some on site. So it seems to be here that that it's mostly a remote audience, or the organizations that are on are mostly remote. And that sort of does jive with what we've seen in our research when we talk to organizations. That I think the overall takeaway is, regardless of what the dynamic is and how things are shifting, there will be more remote workers moving forward than there were previously, right? And I think that's the real takeaway is, yes, things are in flux and they change on a daily basis, but the reality is there are enough remote workers now for most organizations that they have to rethink the way they approach a lot of different processes in the organization. Obviously L&D being one of them, to meet the needs of that workforce. And, the truth is a lot of these remote workers have only been remote for a year, 2 years, maybe 3. I mean, I personally have worked out of a home office for over 10 years. And I know that it can be quite a transition. So it's funny. And Donna points that out. Look at the reality of those on the call here. The smallest group, all on site, only 2.8% of the audience today. So, yeah, that's not too surprising from what we've seen in the research. And so to that end, we do see that from the research that we've done in our studies, we ask organizations where they're going, how they're moving forward. Sorry, that's come through. It's not showing the number, but there's an 84% is the actual number. More than 8 in 10 organizations plan to work in some sort of hybrid model going forward. And again, as you were mentioning, Ryan, it's not the same for every organization. The word hybrid might mean many different things, and it's important to understand that it could mean that some people work remote part of the week, and then they come into the office some other days, and it's never the same day. And so the workforce is in this constant state of flux. You're never really sure who's where and when. And the other thing that the model does is it introduces a bit of synchronicity challenges to organizations that maybe didn't have them before, right? If everybody was coming to the office during the day, everybody was in the same place at the same time. Now, if you've got people working remotely, even if they're in the same time zone, when people are working out of a home office, depending on their job, they might be working at different chunks of time than they used to. So we're not really sure even what the workday is. So there's all these synchronicity issues as well.
And I talk to managers all the time, not just people that are over L&D, but other stakeholders in businesses that have some role in training like their people. And they'll say, but Ryan, like now I have people that work at 7 p.m. their local time. I have people that work at 6 a.m. their local time. I have people that work for 2 hours at a time, and then they take 2 hours off, and they come back and they work for 2 more hours, and they get their job done. But one of the biggest challenges is how do we then, like you said, take the training and make sure that people are able to consume what they need when they're ready to consume it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we take a look at what we've seen within organizations. This is a study that was done a little bit earlier this year. So this is obviously full-blown wake of the pandemic. This isn't 3 years ago. This is earlier this year. And we just want to know, looking at all of the learning that you deliver, what percentage would you say is in-person instructor-led classroom training? And now, when we used to do this kind of research, say 3-5 years ago, as long back as I can remember that we've been doing this research, it was that the in-person instructor-led training was the number one way that organizations were delivering learning by a wide margin. It was always number one. So that was changed drastically. And so what we do see, there is still a lot of in-person ILT that goes on in organizations. 27% say it's anywhere from half to 3/4 of their learning. You even still got 17% say that's anywhere from 3/4 or more, actually 20% if you include the alls. So there's still plenty of instructor-led training that goes on, which, I've always been an advocate, even prior to the pandemic. I've never been one of these analysts or industry watchers that says, there should be no more classroom, right? The death to the classroom. I think obviously there's a strong reason why we do it. But I think what we've been presented with in this dynamic is an opportunity to rethink how we do it. I mean, I would think, Ryan, you might agree that, you're never, even though you're coming from a technology place, it's not that, you want to do any of this stuff at the expense of a classroom experience.
Absolutely not. And it's about meeting your learners with whatever learning style makes the most sense for them. There are plenty of people, and I'm one of them, I cannot only take e-based training. I need to have interactions with people. I need to talk with instructors. I need to talk with my peers, especially when you're talking about more complex situations or more complex industries or ideas. And one of the interesting things that I saw, because I was in my role right before the pandemic, and then obviously I've been in it since, was this move from, we do instructor-led training, in-person instructor-led training, to now we do virtual instructor-led training. Every single customer that I worked with from 2020 on now has some sort of virtual instructor-led training program in place. But now the cool thing is that they're able to use that in conjunction with classroom instructor-led training, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, and I also think that the last couple of years have been a crash course education in the differences between instructor-led classroom training and virtual instructor-led training. I think in the early days, there was this thought that they were one and the same. All it took was some sort of platform to put it on, and I think quickly realized that they require different types of content, different types of interactivity, different types of facilitation and instruction. So clearly a divergence there. So the next one we asked was for it was around LMS course training, like how much of the training that you're delivering comes from LMS based courses, and you can see pretty widespread across the different percentages all over the place here, where 22% say it's anywhere from 1/4 to half of their training. Todd had asked about what the industry sectors were. So all of the research that we're showing, all the data from our study, it's across a very, very wide spread of industries, anywhere, I think it's around 37 different named industries with a handful of quote unquote others. But heavily, the biggest ones are typically in our research, business services, technology, healthcare, things like that. But yeah, doesn't lean toward any one particular industry, and it's also spread across company sizes, very evenly split across small to large organizations. Thanks. And Donna's question about, are we talking about, when we say ILT, in this particular data that we're showing, when we say ILT, we're referring to face-to-face, because that's sort of what we were trying to get after, is what's changing from that perspective. So this obviously drives a wide variety of different complexities. We talked about a lot of them, right? The differences now in the synchronicity changes, rethinking how we're going to be doing instructor-led classroom training. And really what it comes down to is thinking about, okay, what are the skills, the processes, and the tools that L&D is going to need to thrive in this environment? Do we already have those skills and we just have to, and tools, and just have to figure out how best to leverage them? Do we need new and different tools in this environment? Or do we also need a different set of skills within L&D? Do we need to upskill? Do we need to get new talent? Do we have everything we need? Because regardless of what the approach is, what's happening now and in the future is different than what was happening previously. And when you have that rethink of L&D, you have to also take into consideration, can we do what's necessary with what we have, or do we need to change things as we move forward?
And I love what Todd mentioned there, David, there in the chat. Todd asked the question, does the remote position require additional training to work remotely? So, and that's what we always have to be thinking about is training professionals, is our customers are our learners. So if we've got remote people, do we need to train them in how to work remotely successfully?
Yeah, and that's a real thing. We started to do surveys early on during the pandemic, and one of the things we asked, and it really showed the strategic role L&D has played through all of this. Is one of the key things was L&D has to help us transition the workforce, right? People need to get used to these new tools we're using. They have new hardware that they're having to use. All these other things, L&D had to be part of that, and so it wasn't. It's one of these transformations where the L&D as a function couldn't sort of be taken along with the wave of transformation. It had to actually be at the forefront of that and help the organization make that transition. Yeah, and so I see people are already responding to this poll. I appreciate it. We're just curious to know, as we talk about these complexities and the things that companies have to figure out. We were thinking about instructional design, and so we wanted to know, okay, well, what's going on in your organization? Is there no instructional design? Do you not have instructional designers? And that's a fair point. You could be purchasing content off the shelf, having it build custom content, what have you, or maybe you've got just subject matter experts who have the tools that they need to build the content that you're able to deliver. Maybe there are a couple IDs on the team, but a part of a larger team. Or that you have a full team of instructional designers that are focused on building content, or even if there's something other. And if you have another, you can feel free to throw in anything you like into that question box, and we'll see it there. But I just wanted to get a sense of what the current state of instructional design was in the organization. Let's take a look at the results here. And this is pretty across the board here, pretty wide smattering of different things, where you've got just maybe a couple of IDs, but the same number of respondents said that they just use subject matter experts. What do we talked about this, Ryan, before we asked this question. When you look at these results, though, what does that make you think? Because this was a question that you were kind of interested in.
It's always curious to me because, most of the people that I work with don't have a team of instructional designers. So it's people that come in. Oh, go ahead.
No, just.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying something. But most of the folks that I work with don't have a team of instructional designers. They are folks who came into training from other parts of the organization, and they're trying to figure it out as they go along. So this is what I love about these poll results, though, are that we've of course got some people who have no instructional designers, and you're my favorite because you don't have any preconceived notions. You don't have any sort of biases toward anything. So you come into something just ready to accept like all ideas. And then I love to see the folks that are building content, and then how are you building that content? What's changed in the way you were building content before, when people were in the office 100% of the time versus now?
Yeah, and Alan asked a great question, which actually kind of leads us into our next bit of data here. He was asking, what do we think that will be the most difficult in hybrid learning in 2023? And so I think there's a lot of variables in that question, Alan, but first we'll start with what we're seeing in the research. And we asked organizations, what are the challenges when it comes to creating and delivering learning in this environment? And the first one, not too surprising, is not enough time. And I think, you could ask L&D professionals what their biggest challenge is for any facet of their job. And I think not enough time would probably be the first thing. And that's always been the challenge. The other part that we see is also related to time, is that the learners have too many demands on their time. And I think that's something that's very critical to keep in mind as L&D professionals in this new environment. Because while we're trying to figure out new and better ways to reach learners and connect them and deliver the learning in this new environment, keep everybody up to speed, the rest of the organization has also had to adjust to this environment. So they're putting forward different types of collaboration tools and processes and other meetings to keep people connected. And that's sort of what we saw happen, is people started to get a little overloaded with meetings because there was this rush to make sure everyone was constantly connected with this fear of everyone being remote. And so that just gets added on to all of the things that L&D might be asking of learners. And so having to recognize that the learners are very much pressed for time between their jobs and these new sort of dynamics with meetings and keeping connected. How do we best meet their needs without overloading people with yet another meeting or something else that they have to click through? But then you see some of the others, just budget constraints. We don't have the money to do anything differently. Obviously, budgets were affected heavily during this whole time. Inadequate technology. This comes back to what I was mentioning earlier, that do we have the tools to do what we want to do now that the face of learning has changed so dramatically? Do we have the right technologies to meet that? And a third of organizations say they don't. Not enough headcount. That's probably falls right into the same bucket with not enough time, just not having the resources to get this done. And then there's the competencies and skills within L&D, right? Do we have the right things at our disposal? Do we need to even upskill and reskill L&D? I think that's a critical piece too. So much talk about upskilling and reskilling right now as businesses need to be more agile and adjust to change. L&D is in a unique position to not only be delivering those skills, but also looking at its own set of skills and competencies and wondering what we need to address there as well. But looking at this, Ryan, and also thinking about Alan's question about what would be maybe the most difficult thing in the next year in this environment, what are some of your thoughts on the challenges?
Well, I think the first of all, like the time piece is the one piece that we can't create more of. So it's about using your time as wisely as you can, and also using your learners' time as wisely as you can. So people like short, informative, to the point training that's engaging. Which leads right into the technology piece here and the right skills and competencies. So having an LMS, having a vehicle that provides a seamless, fun, and engaging experience with your content is the best way to approach the two biggest hurdles that people are having, which are all about the time that they have available to them. And when it comes to the right competencies and skills, I can tell everyone on the call right now that I've onboarded over 150 customers since I started this role. And out of all of those, there have only been 2 organizations that had people on their team, instructional designers, who were instructional designers by trade. Like they went and received a formal education for instructional design. So when it comes to having the right competencies and skills, that should tell you that everyone else was able to find them, was able to learn those things. And, you don't have to have a degree in instructional design to learn how to create engaging content. As long as you've got the right kind of tools in place, and I think support from your leadership, because it comes down to let's make training, let's make learning a core component of our organization, not an afterthought. So really that feeds into that managers don't support the learning. What we find is that with our customers, the organizations whose management is driving the initiative for learning, not just training. Like let's stop thinking of this as training. It's just onboarding. It's just compliance training. We have to start thinking about this as learning holistically and using our frontline managers to drive that learning engagement throughout the organization.
Yeah, I think the manager role in the learning experience gets overlooked quite a bit. I think when you start to talk about managers and supervisors, the first thought is leadership development, right? How do we build their skills to be leaders and so forth, which is important. But I think almost more importantly is that if we're going to deliver an effective learning experience to the workforce, we have to involve the managers in that, because we start to talk about things like personalization and learning in the flow of work and learning driving behaviors and performance and different outcomes. the managers are the ones that have the closest connection to what all of those things are. They know what the flow of work is. They know what the right behaviors are. They're much closer to the learners as performers than somebody in L&D, an instructional designer or learning professional. So they're the ones that have the insights. And so having that relationship with managers as part of the L&D process to help guide how we're going to put these things together, how we're going to get feedback on how things work. I think, yeah, that's a critical piece for sure. And then, the other thing where you're talking about the instructional designers, and I think that's one of the things companies need to look at is moving forward to the learning world we want to create, maybe we do need some or more instructional designers. That's very valid. But maybe you already have some, and maybe what is needed is more ability to allow subject matter experts to create content quickly and be able to share their knowledge, right? Is that something that we need to be able to do? So we start to think about content. We can't get too hung up on traditional methods and processes. We have to think about what do we need to do moving forward.
And I think that what I see all the time, David, is this perfection paralysis. And I don't know why I think it's with everyone, but I mean, I see it all the time with learning and development professionals. Like, this has to be perfect, or I can't, push this out. If it is not absolutely 100% pristine, then I can't deliver this. Well, first of all, you need to give yourself a little grace because nobody's perfect. And second of all, I tell folks all the time who have this argument, which is, I can't create engaging content because I don't know how to use a content authoring tool. And then my next question is always, have you ever created a PowerPoint presentation? And the answer is always yes, 100% of the time. I don't even need to collect data on that because I just know 100% of the time everyone's created a PowerPoint presentation. If you can create a PowerPoint, and you can learn how to create a PowerPoint, you can learn how to create a piece of training in a content authoring tool. You can do it. So I just am saying all this to encourage folks on the call who might be a little averse to trying one of these tools to just jump in and do it, because I promise you can.
For sure. So looking at the current state where things are, how things are changing, we want to take a look at what's going to happen here in the short term for now, based on the research that we've done. And one thing that's become abundantly clear is, let's look at say the mid 2020 through the middle of 2021. Obviously, big scramble on how do we adjust, and a lot of the solutions that people landed on were quick fixes. We need to do something now to meet our current need. But what's been happening since middle of 2021 for this last year or so is they started to shift into, it turns out that the things that we're trying to do are not simply for this one moment in time, this pandemic moment, and we're just going to fix it for that and then sort of go back to how things were. It turns out that a lot of the things that work and make sense for this environment are very beneficial to the organization, to the learners, and they're the kind of things that we should probably figure out how to do well long term. And so that's really what the shift is then, is that things are going to shift dramatically, and all of the things that companies are looking at putting into place now they're looking at them with an eye on the long term, not with some sort of quick fix that I want to go back to how things were. And so what we'll see is right now, and again, this study was done just a couple of months ago, there's sort of an evening out where ILT has probably dropped off as much as it's going to drop off, right? And it started to come back, but it's not going to come racing back to the levels to which it was before. There's sort of this evening out. If you look at this bell curve where the biggest peak is at remain the same. Yes, some organizations will increase their ILT, but then there are some that will decrease moving forward. So essentially things are starting to even out there, but we're going to see more e-learning, right? So there's going to be a stronger reliance on courses because now we've got people very accustomed to doing things at their own pace, on demand, and what have you. So we're going to start to do things more along those lines. So again, thinking through that, I think that's one of the biggest adjustments in the headspace for L&D professionals is because things were so classroom focused for so long, is trying to make that shift of how do we deliver what we felt was effective in a classroom? How do we do that in a more on-demand, online, self-paced sort of way?
And it's a hard question to answer because it's different for everyone. But we have to ask this of ourselves because this is what our customers, our learners, it's what they expect now. They expect an environment where they can get training on the go, where they can get training on demand, where the majority of the training they receive is more than likely e-learning, as opposed to instructor-led training. Virtual or classroom is not as big of a deal here because most people expect to see their training through an LMS.
True. So that was sort of a rundown of what we found in this particular study around the hybrid workforce and how learning is reacting and adjusting, and we'll move forward. So I wanted to pull up from there some of the sort of go forward strategies that we've determined by looking at the data and the research, as well as talking to dozens of organizations about what's working, what isn't. We also have our library of case studies around organizations who are doing things really well, showing best practices. And so some of the things that we wanted to focus on, and of course, there's a lot of things we can do, and we'd love to hear from the group if you have any questions about this or your own approaches, things that you've found to be successful in your organization over these last couple of years that you said we've landed upon this approach and it seems to work really well. We'd love to hear about that as well. But that's sort of the first takeaway is, okay, what did work, right? I mentioned sort of that scramble of we have to do something because things have completely changed. There's no more in person. Everyone's working from home. Everyone's remote, what have you. What worked during that transition that we should stick with, and what maybe wasn't successful, and let's not do that anymore. My favorite anecdote from this time is an organization that manufactures ice machines. Right, so all different kinds of ice machines that either store or dispense ice, and they need to be repaired and maintained. And the class used to be the trainers would gather in a giant room that had all the different machines, and they would go from machine to machine with the learners, and they would go over all the different aspects of the machine. Pandemic hits, they can't get together in that room anymore. So the trainers took it upon themselves, said, well, the only thing I can think to do is set up a couple of cameras around each machine and then walk through the procedures in real time, live with the trainers. And it turns out the learners liked it better than being in person because the camera angles provided them a much better view of the things that they were supposed to be working on rather than trying to look around and get a good angle on what the instructor was doing. They could hear all the instruction. They weren't missing anything. And so it's something that they've decided to continue on because it turns out this works better than it did before. And so the idea is to really take a look at what are learners, have they responded well to over this time, and figure out how to do more of that, and then try to do less of the things that maybe weren't so successful. I think one of the biggest things that companies have found was not great unless it's done in a really done really well is to simply do your training in a Zoom meeting. You've heard the term Zoom fatigue, and people get overwhelmed with the number of virtual meetings they have to be in because of this environment. And then if suddenly learning looks just like another Zoom meeting, you've suddenly created yourself almost insurmountable in trying to figure out ways to do that. Now, obviously, virtual classrooms are critical to this environment. We have to figure out how to do those so that they fit in, they're engaging, and they get to the point, and they give people what they need. So that's really important there. The second thing is if you are working with in-person and remote workers, and you are trying to do things in a synchronous way, which would make sense in some circumstances, really focusing on how do we do that well. Obviously, a great resource for that would be to look at articles about K-12 education. I know that sounds strange. Usually I don't point organizations to that, but if you look at any articles about K-12 education during the pandemic, with, because you had schools where there would be some kids in the class and some at home, and they're trying to do it synchronously. There's a wealth of information about what didn't work. And those are very applicable in the corporate environment. And so some of the things that do work is, setting ground rules that if we're going to do this synchronously, we've got a group of people here in this one room, and then we've got people remote. Everyone's going to use the same technology, though, because that way we have an even playing field. Or everybody knows the communication ground rules up front. Like there is no just sort of, small non-sanctioned breakout groups in the room, right? We have to make sure everyone follows the same ground rules, just to make sure that everybody is connected and there's parity. And then if you are going to do breakout rooms or subgroups, working groups, it's important to keep those mixed as well, so that everyone's getting all of the right benefits from that activity. And I was just curious, Ryan, in this, over these last couple of years, have you talked to organizations who have been doing some of this stuff, trying to do this sort of hybrid synchronous training?
Oh yeah. Now, obviously in 2020, no one was doing anything hybrid at all because no one was back in the office. But once 2021 hit, and then now to today, just about every single customer that I work with has some sort of component of instructor-led training, where some people are doing it around the country remotely, and other people are doing it there in an office. And it's it's easy for us to sit here and talk about it. It's hard to implement a strategy that works for your learners. But the ones that have had the most success are the ones that don't just put 100 people in a Zoom call and 30 people in a classroom. They use breakout rooms. In fact, Jackie mentioned that in the chat here too. Using breakout rooms, using other forms of learning mixed with the instructor-led training. So it's not just a lecture, because think about the last time you sat through a lecture. Maybe you enjoyed lectures. In my experience, most people don't like just sitting and hearing someone talk on and on and on. We want to see some things. We want to work on some activities together, because the component in the virtual space that you lose compared to the classroom space is that camaraderie that's so easy to build with your peers when you're sitting across a table or right next to them. And that's a hard thing to replicate.
Yeah, and I'll go so far as to say impossible to replicate. And I can't imagine even as fast as technology advances, I don't see in my lifetime being able to replicate that experience of being in a room with other people. And that's the one thing that gets sort of forgotten is, well, this worked so well the last time we had this class. We'll just use that content and present it in this way in a virtual session. What you're not paying attention to is the inherent connection that exists in an in-person environment. Nobody's actively doing anything about it. It's just the fact of people being together in that room creates this level of connection that we are not able to recreate. So we have to be cognizant of that and realize you have to sort of take that next step in what you're delivering, what you're presenting to get a better level of engagement. And I think Jackie's point is great. They've done their best to replicate what they would have done in person, but knowing that you're not going to necessarily actually replicate that experience, right? It's a different experience, so accept that it's different, and then capitalize on what's different about it, because there are actually a lot of advantages to this environment, things that you can do. And as Carl pointed out, a couple of those rules of engagement, like I mentioned, make sure everybody's aware of what those are. I'm echoing that with you. And then communication is the key to success, of course, yes. And that's the key thing, is making sure that everybody, you are communicating to all groups. And then Donna's input here around the flipped classroom, which is a great thing to bring up, because that's something that has been around obviously for a long time. It's been an approach that companies have taken on. It brings a whole new meaning in this sort of hybrid / virtual world, where by putting more of, I don't want to say the onus, but more of the responsibility on the learners, right, as opposed to the instructor, you're then really driving the collaboration, the communication, the connectivity that's required, where a solo instructor just talking to a group you'll start to lose them almost immediately. So,
almost.
Yeah, those are some really great points.
You'd lose me like in 3 seconds. Like, goodbye. I'm gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amber, there's no real chat to look at. And I was looking to see if you could see the chat. These are questions that are coming into us, so we're doing our best to just read them out. So far, I think we've answered all the questions that have come in. So we're hoping we're catching them all, and I think we have been. So that's where that's coming from. Just a few more of these we can talk through, and please keep coming in with your input and your insights and your own experience. It'd be great. And I love Jackie says, never apologize for having to run a session virtually. And no, you shouldn't have to. And this is the world we live in now. So,
but to your point earlier, David, I think that it and just kind of briefly going off of Jackie's point there, never apologize, but also don't be afraid when these virtual sessions start to, just call out, hey guys, like this is a virtual session where we're doing our best to, with the technology we have. And the best way for everyone to get value out of this is if we all participate. So those rules of engagement that we talked about earlier, kind of setting the playing field of we will all learn together, we will all win together, we will all fail together, but the only way any of that's going to happen is if we all participate with one another.
Yep.
So turn your cameras on, come off mute.
Yeah. Well, and it's, the collaboration piece to me is so critical. It's like you think about an in-person event of any kind, whether it's a class, a conference session, what have you. The first thing that happens when that session is over is people will turn to one another and say, what did you think? Did you hear this? What do you think about that? If you're not giving people the ability to do that simply because they're virtual, you've completely missed the boat on what really makes those in-person events so effective. So clearly want to keep going that on there. So the next one is sort of leads us into when you are going to be in person, you want to really think hard about, okay, if we are going to bring people into a classroom setting, let's be really mindful of it, right? I think it was sort of table stakes before when most learning was done in in-person classrooms. So it's just like, well, this is the way we do it. We're just going to do it, and then we're going to run it through this framework. But we now have to be really thoughtful. We're asking a lot now if we're going to ask everybody to come together into one place. So let's make the most of their time. And so as we mentioned before, it's not about someone disseminating information for 45 minutes. There's much better ways to do that. And you can do that before the class through videos or other activities. People can get what they need so that they come into the room, everyone's on the same page, everyone's sort of at the same level. And then we can really leverage that in-person time to the best of our ability by working groups, scenarios, role plays, what have you, but just really taking advantage of the time that you do have people all together in one place instead of just sort of treating it as the way it's always been. The next thing we've actually heard from quite a few organizations, and I'd love to hear from anybody on the call that has the same experience. But in those first couple of years, when the first part of the pandemic, when everyone was sort of working remote, staying home, there's a lot of wait and see because no one really knew, especially early on, how long things were going to last, what the future held. But now that things have sort of settled and there is clearly a lot more remote work, there's going to be less in-person activity. There is a possibility that there's some budget available because, let's face it, in-person activities take a lot of budget, right? There's travel, accommodations, the whole setup, whatever it is. There's, if you want to call it sort of the lost opportunity cost of people who are not working because they're traveling and going to these events. So whatever if there's budget available, it's
Okay, folks, it looks like we're having some technical difficulties. I'm not sure if everyone in the audience can hear me, but we are trying to get back on track here.
I wonder if everyone can still see me. For a second, I thought it was my on 24.
I think I can hear you, Ryan. I can't. I couldn't hear Dave anymore. Yep, they can hear us.
Excellent, excellent. Well, and I think that, guys, just that goes to show you, these are the hazards of these virtual events too. So being able to accept that these things happen, but then the ability to pivot into something different. So one of the things that this last point here, number 5, building or acquiring new skills within L&D, it's something that probably I struggle with the most, because I train people every single day, and at the end of the day, I don't necessarily want to train myself. And admitting that is the first step to overcoming it. So find activities, find things that you enjoy doing, and use those as a basis for how you're going to develop new skills. You'd be surprised at how many people come back to me and say, I didn't think I would ever learn how to create engaging content. But the moment I suggested to them to start with building engaging content that they want to learn about, it's just flipping the script on yourself. It's tricking yourself into creating something that you enjoy doing. And I think we might have David back.
You do, see? This is one of the things they don't tell you about these virtual events, right?
Exactly. That's what I just said.
Yeah. So that we wanted to give you a practical example. But yeah, I appreciate you covering for me, and I know we have plenty to say there. I'm assuming you started just continue talking about you were into talking about L&D skills, or we still talking about budget? Yeah.
I went on into the skill sets that we could focus on for ourselves, and you joined back right as I finished my thought. So really, your timing's impeccable. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. So yeah, and yes, I always need a backup plan for VILT sessions. And I did have a phone number to dial in, but I felt like I needed to be able to see the slides, and I didn't want to leave Ryan alone on camera. So I decided to muscle through and log back in. So I appreciate everyone's patience there. But yeah, so this was just the sense of what we found talking to companies, what they had been through, where we think things are headed. Again, some of the high-level strategies that we've seen companies focusing on, things that are working. So from there, I think we want to have any more questions, please. We love answering the questions. It's been great so far. So any other questions that you have, please feel free to shoot those. Yeah.
We missed one. Katie McInnes, she mentioned that they do lab groups of 6 people with instructors leading the activities. And then great. I don't know the answer to this, but her question is there an ideal number of online learners in a group? So I'm going to assume we're talking about virtual instructor-led trainings. So we're only talking about online, and if there is an ideal number. I have a thought.
I do too.
Well, you go first.
Okay. So, an ideal number. So for any kind of session to be truly interactive and collaborative, and you probably won't see this number. It's not like published in an academic paper or anything, but it's just, to me, it's around 7. And I know that someone had said 6. So to me, that's sort of where I land, is around 7. I feel that when you get beyond that, you start to get less participation, either by choice or by force, because people can't seem to get anything in edgewise. And then less than that, then you don't have as much variety and collaboration as you might need. So I think just, granted, you're not going to run a series of 7-person virtual classrooms for the foreseeable future, but it's more of around, if you really want to get into, subgroups, breakout rooms, small cohorts, that's typically where we tend to see things work. And I think you'll find that not only in learning groups, but if you ask like software developers and what's the ideal size for a Scrum team, they're probably in about the same neighborhood. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that one, Ryan.
I always think back to like my university classes, and like there's that big accounting 101 class that had 150 people in it, and no one participated. But then once I got further along in my major, in my cohort, and I got to my classroom sizes of 10 people, suddenly everyone, all 10 people, now of course some people are participating more than others, but now all 10 people are actively participating in the discussion every single day. So I think for Katie, the ideal number depends on the subject matter and its complexity, and the type of environment the instructor creates. But it's somewhere, I think, between what you're doing, which is 6 and 10, because that's where people, which 7 is probably the lucky number then, between 6 and 10, as it lets people have other folks to bounce ideas off of, but also feel like they should be participating, because otherwise it's just crickets.
Yeah. I'm just looking through, and it's funny, I saw a question that we'll get to right here, but there was also a comment that sort of speaks to that question, right? So the question is, from Kamala, since time and learner demands are big obstacles, right? So, obviously that learners have too many demands on their time. If you push free work, what percentage of learners are actually doing it in order to maximize that in-person learning? And so, I don't have an answer that says, oh, I know that 80% of people are doing their pre-work. I think it really comes down to, what does that pre-work look like? How have you structured it? How are you incentivizing people to do it? Are you giving them that line of sight as to what the payoff is? That here's why this is important for you. How are you delivering it? What's the adoption plan? How are we communicating? I think that's what's really critical, because there's always that chance that, here, do this on your own time. Will people do it? So if you're providing an incentive for them to do it, are you making it a requirement? Depending on what it is, that might not work in all situations. Some it might. That this is a requirement. You have to establish that you've done this in order for us to move on. And so that brings me to this insight that Donna shared, was that their learners are learning at a deeper level now that they get their didactic on their own time, and then they talk, engage, and practice synchronously or online when face-to-face. So I think that's really ideally what we're talking about, is if you're able to get the sort of fat out of the classroom, right? Get people they can do these certain things on their own. Then when they are together, whether it's virtually or in person, but they're spending their time doing deeper things in that moment. So I appreciate both of you for that. Thank you.
And the pre-work piece for me is something that I see customers doing all the time. It's the bit of work. Now the key is to make it worthwhile and engaging, but it's that little bit of pre-work that's happening before they're coming together with a group of people or with an instructor for one-on-one learning, so that there's a basic understanding of the material.
Yep. Oh, Nicole asks a nice one here. Any thoughts on neuroscience learning tips? And it's interesting. We in our studies have asked organizations, how important are these principles? And those companies that say that their learning approach is helping them prepare for the future of work, like they feel like they're in a good position based on what their approach to learning is, they're far more likely to acknowledge and adopt those type of neuroscience learning principles. And obviously, Ryan and I are not going to be able to give a dissertation on neuroscience here in the next 5 minutes. But I think the idea is there's plenty next time. But there's plenty out there to look at. But the idea of spaced learning, right, giving people a chance to come back to material, reinforcement, practice is becoming huge. Organizations are finally realizing how important practice is. Here's a skill, here's a behavior, we can present it to you, but then give you an opportunity to actually try it instead of having to try it in real time where the consequences might be counterproductive. Instead, you can use the practice as an actual learning event where you're seeing what works, what doesn't, getting better, learning by doing, trial and error, that sort of thing. So those kinds of principles are obviously super important, and companies are really coming around to, as they start to rethink the way they present learning, and they're providing all these different types of learning experiences. How do those feed into the ways in which people learn, or those neuroscience principles? So yes, I think there's a lot to be explored there when you start to rethink how you're creating your learning experiences, for sure.
There's another great question. There's a ton of great questions and comments, but just a quick win for everybody. Cassie asked, where can I find resources to create engaging content? And I'll tell you, like I tell everybody else, Google. And that's just where I would start. But if you Google how to create engaging content, because I literally do this all the time, all sorts of blogs and resources from instructional designers, from content authoring tools. So most of your big players out there, like your Adobe Captivate, Articulate Rise, iSpring, they've all got blogs that they run where they talk about best practices for creating engaging content, what approaches to use, especially for adult learners, how we like to receive learning. So I encourage you to start there, and any of those three that I mentioned, as well as the Litmos blog, the SAP Litmos blog, are great places to find resources for creating some engaging content of your own.
Yep. I get one here, and maybe, I don't know if you touched, but from Alexis, talking about how they do monthly, they do a deep dive presentation on a certain topic. And I think I'm reading about 80 or so individuals. I think that's the number that was typed in here. But just wondering, on the topic, participation and engagement varies depending on topics. So any best practices to increase engagement, participation, any tips to improve the experience? So for me, engagement starts before the program. So the engagement can't just be, once people get in, we got to wow them and engage them. It's what's going to drive someone to want to be there. And so providing people up front with, hey, here's this thing that we're doing. Here's why it's important. Here's why it's meaningful to you specifically. And it's going to matter to how you do your job or moving forward. Here are the goals of this. Here's what should happen as a result of you attending. So you start to build this engagement before we actually start the program, before they even get in there. And then once you're in there, this type of environment that you're saying, this deep dive presentation, I think a good rule of thumb is, if it's possible, if it's one person doing the presentation, limiting the stretch of time for which they speak without turning back to the group for a question or some sort of activity or something. I know sometimes, as Ryan was talking, those can be challenging depending on the size of the group, but trying to find something that fits with the size of the group you're working with, to break it up so there's at least some back and forth, some interaction at certain amounts of time, so you don't lose anybody. Or barring that, making sure that you have more than one presenter. I'm sure nobody on this call would have wanted to listen to me for an hour alone. So having Ryan here to help share thoughts and bounce ideas off of makes it that much better. So being able to do it in that way, I think, is a way to drive engagement once people are in. And then making sure that you are delivering on what you said you deliver. When you say, if you attend this session, here's what we're going to do, and here's what we're going to give you, and you're going to be able to use it in these ways. Having success doing that creates more engagement in the future. They said, wow, I did this before and it did this, so now I want to do the next one. So there's just some quick ideas that I have some thoughts on that. I don't know if, Ryan, you had anything you wanted to add to that.
World, other than that, because those are all fabulous points, real world rewards. You will be astounded at what folks will do for a $10 Amazon gift card, or entry into the raffle, or the first 3 people that register get to go to lunch with Alexis. I mean, there are so many things that perhaps you've got some leftover budget that you can use to incentivize people to engage with your training more.
And you don't even have to start there. Another anecdote from one of our conferences, we had an award-winning organization was presenting on their particular program. They had won an award for their learning program. And it's this fantastic program, and the tail end of the presentation was about how it was a great program, but they were constantly somewhere around like 88% completion rate. They couldn't figure out why. They were trying to figure out how to drive it. And they literally just added a step where participants could print out a completion form, a certificate that said they completed it. And completion went to 95%. And so just that little bit of motivation. Yeah.
Yeah. So there it is. You don't even need to get an Amazon gift card, folks. Just get a certificate.
Yeah, something like that. But appreciate that, everybody, all the questions. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for all the inputs and responding to the polls. Ryan, thank you so much for hanging out with me. I appreciate it. And of course, thanks to Litmos for putting on the hour for us. It's been great. So again, thanks to everyone that joined and participated. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody who joined. It was a pleasure. Had a lot of fun.